Welcome to the panel, Democracy in Peril, Looking Back to Go Forward, which is part of the Newmark Civic Life Series and the 92nd Street Y Recanati Copland Talks. The Newmark Civic Life Series, supported by Craig Newmark Philanthropies, is known for conversations with leading experts exploring pro-democracy efforts at this critical moment in the US and around the world. And the 92nd Street, New York, Recanati Kaplan Talks are where the world gathers to share ideas. I'm Catherine Brewster, President and Executive Director of BC Voices, Inc., a nonprofit telling the stories through short documentaries of American women from the founding to today, facing challenges and driving change for full equality. I will be the moderator of this illustrious panel. I'm excited to introduce you to three fantastic women steeped in the fight for social justice, who will explore what the history of the fight for social justice can teach us about protecting democracy during this time of retrenchment, and what it can tell us about the resilience, resistance, and leadership we need in this moment. Marlene Gerber-Fried, a longtime reproductive rights activist scholar, is well known nationally and internationally as a writer, lecturer, and advocate for reproductive freedom. For 37 years, she was a philosophy professor at Hampshire College, where she was also interim president from 2010 to 2011. In addition, she was founding president of the National Network of Abortion Funds and the Abortion Rights Fund of Western Massachusetts. Currently, she is on the board of Women Help Women, as well as board member of Collective Power for Reproductive Justice, and serves on the abortion and contraception panel for Our Bodies, Ourselves Today. Along with Jael Silliman, Loretta Ross, and Elena Gutierrez, she co-authored Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organizing for Reproductive Justice, and is co-author with Loretta Ross of Abortion and Reproductive Justice, an Essential Guide for Resistance, coming soon from the University of California Press. Loretta J. Ross is a professor at Smith College in the program for the study of women and gender, where she teaches courses on white supremacy, human rights, and calling in the call-out culture. She is also a recipient of a MacArthur Fellow Class of 2022 for her work as an advocate of reproductive justice and human rights. During her career, Loretta was one of the first African-American women to direct a rape crisis center and the third executive director of the DC Rape Crisis Center. She founded the National Center for Human Rights Education in Atlanta, Georgia, launched the Women of Color program for the National Organization for Women, and was the National Program Director of the National Black Women's Health Project. Loretta co-created the Theory of Reproductive Justice and was the national coordinator of the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective from 2005 to 2012. She has a new book out, Calling In: How to Start Making Change with Those You'd Rather Cancel. Ruth Reichard has worked as a deputy prosecuting attorney in Indianapolis, Marion County, and served as a judge and senior judge in the state of Indiana for almost 3 decades, where her caseload included major felonies, criminal family violence cases, and civil protection order cases. After leaving full-time employment as a judge, she pivoted to academia, and among other jobs, worked as an assistant teaching professor and director of the Legal Studies program in the Political Science Department at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. Ruth is the author of Blood and Steel, Ryan White, The Age Crisis and Deindustrialization in Kokoma, Indiana, an urban and social history that made the 2022 nonfiction shortlist for the Indiana Humanities Indiana Authors Award. Currently, Ruth volunteers with the Gay Men's Health Club and Heritage of Pride, which staffs the New York City Pride March. Thank you three for being here, and let's start our discussion. The first question we're going to reflect on is from the work you are doing now. What are the most pressing concerns that you see? And I'm going to ask Marlene if you would start first.
Hello, everyone, and thanks to Catherine and the Y for hosting this conversation, and for all of you in the Zoom room for joining in. Meeting this moment of racial capitalism requires all of our courage, optimism, and imagination. And I'm awfully proud to be here with people who have an abundant amount of all three. For the past 40 years, I have been focused on abortion rights in a reproductive justice frame. That would be even before there was a reproductive justice frame. But abortion not as a single issue. And for people who are less familiar with what it means to look through a reproductive justice lens, there are basically four pillars: the right to have a child when you want, the right not to have a child when you don't want to, the right and resources to parent your children with safety and dignity, and the right to bodily autonomy and sexual freedom. It is not, and probably news to anyone here, that there is heightened danger to pregnant people who need abortion care, miscarriage management, and birthing services. Abortion bans kill pregnant people, even before Dobbs and Trump, but a big boost with them. And I just need to say the names of 5 women who have died from restrictive abortion and other legislation: Amber Nicole Thurman, Candy Miller, Jocelyn Barnica, Portia Ngumenza, and Nevaeh Crane. All died from care that was denied or delayed because of fears about what the law allowed people to do. Today, slashing Medicaid impacts the 42% of births that it covers. And of course, in all of these examples, it's the most vulnerable people who are most harmed. And there will be more deaths and suffering. I don't blame the doctors for denying or delaying care. They face 99 years in prison in some cases and $100,000 in fines and loss of licenses. But I do celebrate those who are able to refuse to capitulate. And it's not just the doctors. Fierce Indigenous activist Koya Whitehead Carter, who recently passed, asked us all to ask ourselves, what can you do in this moment? What are you prepared to do in moments of heightened surveillance and control? Criminalizing pregnancy is off the charts, punishing pregnant people's behavior off the charts. So we will all really have to answer Koya's questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Marlene. And Loretta, what are the concerns that the pressing concerns that you see at this moment from the work you're doing?
For the past 30 or 40 years, I've been studying the fascist movement worldwide, and in particular here in the United States. So I feel kind of like a Cassandra who's been saying, they're coming, they're coming. But like Cassandra was not believed until Trump came down that golden escalator. And per se, what we're seeing now is the active destruction of democracy. And so, as a human rights activist, my greatest concern is that the values of human rights are being trampled on, the rule of law is being disregarded, and our society is descending into mutual cauldrons of hatred. I think that we are at risk of not only having democracy cease to be the logical system for which we try to advance human rights, but we're also risking the future of the planet as well with this descent into nihilism, oligarchy, as they call it, where the tech companies are allying themselves with this anti-democratic force called Trumpism, but I would also call fascism. And so I think that's the gravest risk. And those of us who believe in human rights are somewhat concerned because our stance is so ambivalent and ambiguous. We are not prepared to occupy the conservative position of defending the rule of law and the Justice Department and court systems and things like that have not historically been the best friends of people who are marginalized because of their identities or their race, their gender identity, their citizenship status, those kinds of things. But at the same time, we can't afford to abandon our
Mhm.
belief in democratic struggle and democratic principles, even if those things have never been fully achieved in the United States. And so I believe, though, that I'm rather an optimist, despite the fact that I spend my time looking at the vomit of the world. I believe that the people we are fighting who are opposed to human rights only actually have two things going for them, and that is lies and violence. And on our side, we have the truth, we have history, we have evidence, and most of all, we have time. And so if we don't self destruct in our inability to turn to each other instead of on each other, as the fascists would desire us to do, we will eventually bring in a century of human rights and surpass everything that these people who are trying to revert us back to the 19th century are trying to achieve. But I am concerned with the tendency of people fighting for human rights to cannibalize each other with the call out and the cancel culture. And so that's why I've devoted the last 10 years of my life writing a book on that topic. How we have to start having conversations with people we didn't think we could talk to, with people we didn't think we needed to talk to, and with
Mhm.
people who are not dedicated to fascism, but don't quite know how to respond to it. And so this is where I am mostly focused on.
Mhm.
My concerns is the potency of this last gasp of a dying ideology
Mhm.
called fascism
Mhm.
and how many people is going to murder, maim, and displace.
Right.
And at the same time, I believe in the inevitability of justice. And I refuse to succumb my hope to the
Good.
forces of darkness.
I really like that. Refusing to succumb your hope to the forces of darkness. Right. Mm. I think we're all going to need that, but thank you for that. Thank you for that. Ruth, what are you seeing as pressing concerns in this moment?
Well, I come to this panel as someone who is a legal professional and has been for most of my life. So I very much value the rule of law and understand how important it is to our foundation as a functioning nation, but also as a student of history and someone who has seen change over time. And so the way I view it in terms of LGBT history in particular is the our experience of the law has been both a sword and a shield. And once it was definitely a sword throughout most of US history, um, until the 1960s, when the civil rights movement took basic human and civil rights and through the use of the court system and Congress, extended those rights to the whole country, not just the North, but the whole country. And that was not necessarily popular, especially in the South. You may be old enough to remember watching the news and seeing presidents send federal troops to the South to enforce desegregation orders. But it happened because everyone respected the rule of law and valued order. And so the LGBT movement started using the court system as its own shield to get those basic human and civil rights extended to uh, the sexual minority community. And, so we've gone very quickly from a situation where to be LGBT was to be secretive, shamed, harassed, subject to, physical violence, not to mention job discrimination, to a world where, it's very difficult to be fired, especially under federal law. If you're LGBT, you're able to be married, you're able to adopt children and start a family. And so we have seen a huge shift, and that has been because of rights that were granted to the LGBT community through the court system. And so the rule of law is, what makes us all obey the law, even though we may not like it or we may not agree with it. I mean, President Eisenhower was not a fan of Brown versus Board of Education, but he sent federal troops to the South to start to enforce that order. And Miranda versus Arizona, the famous case that gave the world the Miranda rights that police had to read to suspects when they were taken into custody. That was a very unpopular decision at the time it was announced. It was during the 1960s, and the establishment viewed the streets as lawless anyway, and institutions like the New York Times ran articles saying things like, well, all the criminals are going to go free now because of this Miranda decision. But after living with it for close to 60 years, we see that it's an indispensable part of a functioning court system in which hopefully the innocent have some protections. So I just want to point out that, what I have seen is the law being used, as I said earlier, as both a sword and now a shield for sexual minorities. And we have examples now that are definitely calling into question the rule of law. And legislation to overturn Obergefell v. Hodges, which was the 2015 Supreme Court decision allowing same-sex marriage, that's been introduced in 5 states this year alone. And if the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, were to decide to return that issue to the states, as they did with abortion, at least those 5 states would seriously consider doing away with same-sex marriage. The Attorney General in Texas has declared court orders. These are court orders to change the gender markers of trans people on their government IDs, like driver's licenses, to be void. And so has advised their Department of Motor Vehicles that they no longer have to honor those orders. And of course, we've seen at the federal level, the State Department has been changing trans people's gender markers on their passports. There's some indication that this has been happening in Florida on state IDs. And this is being done without the individual trans people's permission, let alone without any due process in terms of notice and an opportunity to be heard and to have an impartial judicial arbiter weighing in on the decision. In fact, as I said, the Texas Attorney General has used the words void. And so we have someone from the executive branch in a state government calling the judicial branch's orders void, as opposed to going through the normal process, which is appealing those orders to a higher court. And, just recently, it's so hard to keep up on a federal level because everything is happening at a head-spinning pace. But, yesterday I read that President Trump intimated that President Biden's pardons were void. because an auto pen was used. I guess I don't have personal knowledge of whether an auto pen was used, but again, we have someone in the executive branch, making a legal determination. And anyone who's been to law school knows that the words void and voidable are very heavily weighted legal terms of art that we don't just toss around, in regular conversation. So to use that word calls into question, the executive branch's willingness to enforce orders, as I said, even orders that they don't agree with, which would be unprecedented and very, very concerning. So
Thank you, Ruth. Unprecedented and concerning. Yes. Right. All right. So what can history tell us? And in particular, what past time periods of retrenchment can come to mind as being helpful? Because we have been through retrenchments before. And so for each one of you, what is it that comes to mind? And what lessons can we learn from those time periods of how people responded, what they did, what kind of leadership emerged from it? And Loretta, I'm going to ask you if you would start us off on this.
Well, if you follow the arc of Black history in America, you see that every time there is a slight progress towards equal protection under the law, equal opportunity in our society, there's a white backlash to that. And so we are always in this ebb and flow of the resurrection of white supremacy domination. At the same time, we try to use our laws, our norms, and our standards to create the America that we all dreamed could ever come about. We feel like we're prisoners of a country that's yet to be in existence because of the rapidity with which even our slightest progress can be pushed backwards simply through a presidential election, as if there's no permanence to our citizenship status, because it all seems to be at the whim of an electoral college. And so we're dealing with institutional norms that are antiquated and fragile, as President Trump is proving. And so the security we all collectively thought that we had in our democratic processes is proving to be ephemeral. It's proving to be unstable. And so what kind of new order is going to emerge in a post-Trump situation? And I do believe there will be a post-Trump situation because, again, it's an ebb and flow. I think that there's always a resurgence of the drive for freedom and justice after the white supremacist backlash. So I take a lot of comfort in knowing that that is inevitable as well. But what kind of new order is going to emerge where we start thinking about how abundant our country is versus how scarce people try to make it? We don't have a lack of food or a lack of money or a lack of compassion. We have these things in recession because of some people's greed for power and money. And so, like the world's food supply, it's not that there's not enough food in the world, there's a maldistribution of the world's food. We're paying farmers to bury food rather than to feed hungry people with it, for example.
Right.
And so I think that the new human rights movement is going to have to project a vision of what we want, a vision where we understand the proper role of government, not to harass and intimidate dissidents as is being weaponized now, but in fact to protect people's needs, to help people achieve their desires, even to go back to Franklin Roosevelt's four freedoms, speaking of history: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, those kinds of things, those 4 freedoms are still values that I think the majority of the American public wants and believes in. And so we can't give into despair just because this tiny minority of people have decided to subvert the entire democratic process for their own profitable ends. It's that they're simply not a true reflection of where the world is headed. So we can learn a lot from history. We have never had such a lawless president before, and the fact that that he is teamed with a bunch of people who have no moral compasses apparently, and no principles on which they stand, and are willing to betray every oath they've ever sworn in the pursuit of their own profits. It's pretty unprecedented right now. And yet I still believe that they have a short shelf life because they have to lie to the very people that they manipulate. They can't even afford to tell the truth about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that works to our advantage because I believe there's more people who believe in truth, integrity, honesty, and justice than don't. And so we've got to just make sure that we don't forget those people, forget our values, and end up replicating what we're fighting. We cannot descend to their level. We will never, ever be as violent as people who make lying and violence their chief register.
Loretta, are there specific, can you give some examples of some of the past time periods of the expansion and then the contraction, then expansion, contraction?
Well, obviously, after the Reconstruction period following the Civil War, we had the backlash to it that was called the redemption, which is why Trump always uses that phrase redemption, so that he can hearken back to the time that the federal government chose to withdraw troops from the South and allowed Jim Crow segregation, of course, always sanctioned by the Supreme Court as well,
Right.
to retake our country and set us back. We've had a president named Woodrow Wilson who fired all the Black people out of the civil service. At the same time, these jobs within the federal government were moving towards economic democracy, providing more opportunity for people. Of course, we've had a backlash to the election of President Obama. Trump would have never been elected if it wasn't for a white backlash to America's first Black president. And so we could go on and on. I think that there's a backlash against Native Americans with the success they have of trying to develop some financial independence with their casinos and their territorial claims and stuff. Well, then there's a backlash against them, including the increased murders of Native American women and things like that, and the backlash to the women's movement, of course, which is now manifesting with this restrictions on birth control, abortion, and sex education, which Marlene can more effectively talk about. And so we just always have to keep our eyes on forward motion and the fact that they are always beaten back. If they could have won the Civil War the first time, they would have. And the fact that they keep trying it again and again just shows their impotence and their striking lack of originality. Because they keep
Oh, I love that. Striking lack of originality.
they have to use an authoritarian playbook. I mean, it took Hitler 53 days to destroy democracy in Germany, and Trump is only, a few more days over that
Right. Yeah.
right now.
Right.
And so the parallels are there if we study history, because they actually don't try new things. They just have better toys to do the old things.
Oh, right. Thanks, Loretta. Ruth, what are your thoughts on this? Are there some particular, periods of retrenchment in terms of LGBTQ rights that you can talk about and what we can learn from that?
Well, I'm sure everyone watching this is aware of the Lavender Scare and the fact that after World War II, communists and gay people, then referred to as homosexuals or deviants, were targeted primarily by the federal government, but also by state governments, um, and lost their jobs. On the state level, they mostly went after teachers, public school teachers, for indoctrinating students. That was the fear, at least, both in communism and homosexuality. On the federal level, it was in the civil service, as Loretta alluded to, and mass purges took effect if people self-reported, they lost their jobs. If they were uh, reported by someone else, or they were, the victim of rumors or hearsay, they were very much still in danger of losing their jobs. And that had the effect of, as I mentioned earlier, it caused a lot of shame, a lot of secrecy, um, a lot of hiding. And it was a very difficult time to be a sexual minority. But not everyone was passive. And there's an astronomer named Franklin Kameny, Kameny, and he was actually trained at Harvard during the 1950s, got his PhD in astronomy, and got his dream job working for the United States Army in the map division. And he was fired for being homosexual. And and he was only 32. So he had his whole life in front of him, and he could have easily switched careers or done something else. But as I said, this was his dream career. And he fought back. He wrote to in the early 60s, he wrote to then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, complaining of discrimination. He sued the Civil Service Commission and took them all the way to the US Supreme Court, where he lost, but he did not give up. He picketed wearing a suit and tie, but he picketed the White House. He picketed outside other federal buildings. He was joined some days by other well-dressed homosexuals, men and women who supported him and who themselves had a lot to lose by being on those sidewalks carrying those signs, but they did it. And they didn't see results overnight, but by the end of the 1960s, the Federal Service Commission, Civil Service Commission, and some state and city civil service commissions outlawed discrimination against people based on sexual orientation or being a sexual minority, as we would say, at least with respect to being gay and lesbian. So this is a situation where no, results did not happen overnight, but results did happen. And, Franklin Kameny, he should be taught, in the history books, just like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. I mean, he's someone that is not in the mainstream history books, but should be known about, because of his courage and his willingness to stand up and be active in the face of victimization instead of passive. I will just say within less than 20 years after Kameny was fired, the post office no longer discriminated against homosexuals and the federal civil service no longer discriminated. New York City quit discriminating in the late 1960s, and you can track it all around the country that, things did get better, but it's going to take courage, and it's going to take patience. It's going to take resilience. And we can look to our ancestors in the LGBT community and also in the civil rights community and our foremothers in the reproductive rights community for examples for all of us.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. Thanks. Courage, patience, resilience, and don't give up. That's what I'm getting from, right? Marlene, so in the reproductive justice area, what can you talk about of a period retrenchment and how do people respond? What can we learn from that for today?
I would like to add to Ruth's a prescription to us about what we need for the long game. Part of what Loretta and Ruth are telling us is that it's a long game. And so I would add to that bravery and tenacity to stay with it. That we're not just in a moment. We talk about this moment of history. We're not in a moment. And we also need imagination because we're not just trying to resist or stave off what's coming at us, but we are trying to build something new. And the other thing I wanted to add in terms of finding sources of inspiration, people who stand up in the face of it. Loretta and I have a colleague at Smith College who is creating a 500-year timeline of reproductive justice. And one of the things that she's doing is lifting up the stories of the unsung heroes, the people that we don't know about, who have been the pioneers and our foreparents in this. So I think that, and it's called The Roots of Reproductive Justice, Roots of RJ. So what I would say, it just ditto to a lot of the things that Loretta said about in the past, during the period of enslavement, birth control was for enslaved women was not permissible, nor was abortion. And yet, throughout that period, people found ways of doing it. I think one thing we have to say, it's implicit in everything we've been talking about, retrenchment, surveillance, oppression doesn't fall the same on all people of all races, classes, and sexualities. And so one of the things I think about this current moment is that white people are getting a lesson in the fragility of rights, a lesson that much more vulnerable populations have known forever. I mean, Loretta has often said, the justice system never really brought justice to us. So I think that's not to say that division or those divisions are impossible to overcome. I mean, part of when we get to the third part, if we get there, I do think that we have to overcome that, but we can't get there unless we acknowledge that this is all falling disproportionately on different people. And just a few specific, before Roe v. Wade, when abortion was illegal, it was criminalized for about 100 years. People found solutions. They used informal systems, which is very similar to what's happening today after Dobbs. So the organization that I've devoted a lot of my recent decades to, the Network of Abortion Funds, these abortion funds were created even before Roe as community-based solutions to the fact that there was no access to abortion, raising money, helping people get to places where they could get. And of course, today with abortion pills, the same impulse is allowing people to distribute and disseminate information about how to have abortion outside the medical system. And it sort of takes us back to the 1960s and to the taking knowledge and expertise back into our own hands. And I think about the Our Bodies Ourselves collective, which created, it wasn't supposed to ever be a book. What it was supposed to be was people getting together to get the knowledge that they did not have about their bodies. And the fact that it not only became a book, I guess it's been one of the 100 most important books of the century, from times, and it tells us something about the crying need for such information. I think we also have become maybe better at learning from the global South. The reproductive rights movement, not the justice movement, was very insular. It really didn't know much about what was going on. The reproductive justice movement was born from the global South and international women's health organizing. Abortion pills came to us from the global South. Women in Brazil noticed that misoprostol, a drug that was given for ulcers, said on it, "Do not take if pregnant." So they connected those dots and
Right. Yeah.
how to take that technology into
Right.
their own hands. And then I just think a couple more things about this. Oh, and I think having a global perspective in terms of solidarity as well. So there's something in Poland called the Abortion Dream Team, which is actually a European creation.
Mhm.
And the goal is to try and overturn the laws in Poland and elsewhere. And finally, in this part, which is a return to ancestral knowledge and practices, learn from the people who have survived and thrived through these unbelievable periods of retrenchment and oppression. So I would leave it at that but I want to just not underemphasize the importance of hope and optimism, even in the face of all of this. I mean, if we didn't have hope, those of us on the screen wouldn't keep doing what we're doing.
So hope and optimism, and Loretta, you had talked about hope earlier too, having hope, not allowing ourselves to succumb to the despair, but to remember the hope. So hope and optimism. And a couple of the other things that I've heard you mention, Marlene, were bravery and tenacity, imagination, finding solutions even in the midst of the repression. So, you know, there's that, I call it the underground, someone think of it this way, the resistance that's still going on. It might not feel like much, but sometimes it's kind of going on like this, and then it builds, you know, it surfaces and it comes up. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so now what are some examples right now of strategies that are aimed at defending rights and more expansively building a cross-issue movement? What are some things you're aware of that are happening today? Particular strategies for getting us. So Ruth, would you start us off on this?
I will be happy to answer that. But before I do, I wanted to kind of dovetail with what Loretta was bringing up about the rhetoric around lack and fear and negativity. There's a wonderful book by a scholar named Heather McGhee, McGhee, called The Sum of Us, SUM, as in addition and math. And, you know, basically, I'm hugely oversimplifying her thesis, but that if we stand together and realize that all of these restrictions and discriminations and attacks affect all of us, as opposed to just, well, minorities or, you know, people have committed crimes or other things, we are so much stronger. Collectively, we are so much more powerful than we are if we're divided. And the rhetoric that we have seen, especially in the campaign last year, you know, on one side, there was hope and optimism and unity. On the other side, it was basically, to paraphrase the American President movie, you know, I'm going to tell you who to be mad at and what to be afraid of, you know, and so who to be mad at and what to be afraid of, that rhetoric won last year. But it doesn't need to always win. You know, it appeals to the part of your brain that is reptilian, but what actually feels better is understanding the truth that if we have so much more in common than different, and if we act in a unified manner, we're so much more powerful than we are when we're divided. So keep your antenna up, and if someone's trying to divide you, understand they're coming from a place of weakness. So I guess to return to your question, Catherine, it's what is happening now. I can't speak for the entire LGBT movement. I do know lots of lawsuits have been filed, and they've been filed by very good lawyers who are very skilled at what they do. And assuming that precedent holds and the rule of law holds, that is an excellent strategy. But I'd like to take it on a much more micro and concrete level. Let's say it all blows up, tomorrow. Well, LGBT people, even in my generation and definitely older, have been very good at passing. We've been very good at hiding our identity for what we need to do at the time, whether it's go to work, keep our jobs, etc. And one thing we learned is after Stonewall, throughout the 70s and even the 80s, when the AIDS crisis was very, very scary and threatening on an existential level to LGBT people, it is so powerful, we learned after Stonewall and before then, thanks to Frank Kameny, to share your story and how things affect you as an individual. And mark my words, having moved here from Indiana, there are people all around this country in rural areas who think they're the only person like them. And what is powerful and what is affirming is to realize I'm not the only person like me. Yes, I'm a minority, but it's not just me. And there is so much power in networking and again, standing together and realizing that, as I said, just the power of sharing your story and how things affect you with loved ones on a micro level can really be a force for change, and may make loved ones or friends or people at work think twice before they go the way of fear and buy into that rhetoric and instead think, no, I don't know, my aunt says something else, so I'll just leave it at that. There are lots of examples I can point to, but we only have a few more minutes left, and Marlene and Loretta have good things to say, but I would just leave it with that, is don't give up and remember and respect the power of an individual to share their story and their truth.
Right. Thank you, Ruth. Don't give up. Empower an individual to share their story and truth. Great. Marlene?
Yes, I'll pick up on some of those themes. I see we are all of very similar minds here, which is always affirming. I want to pick up on the anger and the fear part, because I too am propelled by fear and anger. But I also see, looking down the long road of my own history of activism and everyone else's, that we can be propelled by anger, but we have to translate that into relentless resistance if we're going to get past it. So I think that that's critical. And here comes the hope. When I think about what should we do now, the hope is that in dismantling everything, better things can come. There is the possibility for building better structures for existence. And so similarly, for in the abortion area, Roe v. Wade was really never enough. It was supposed to be the floor, not the ceiling. It never gave access to people who didn't have resources.
Mm-hmm.
So while I don't mean to be glib. I'm not excited that it was overturned, but a lot of people have now begun to see what else is required beyond just the legal right to something. That you can have the legal right to something, but that doesn't mean you have that something.
Right.
And I think that's what we all learned that from the critique of Roe, and now from the from the Dobbs that overturned it. I would say also in reproductive justice activism, sharing of stories, both at the level that you're talking about, which is very important, the Thanksgiving table, where people, having worked with students for years, they always dreaded going back up. How am I going to talk to my uncle? Is critical. I'm not advocating blow up your Thanksgiving table, but still to speak at that one-on-one level, but also sharing of stories in our movement has been a public strategy. So that in the early 1970s, when the only people who were really being heard about whether abortion was important were doctors and lawyers and politicians, what did the feminist movement do? It created spheres for people to tell their stories in churches, in community centers. And some of it is to stand up and say, you know what, I'm going to not succumb to the shame and stigma that society is putting onto this. But some of it is also, again, a way of creating a bridge or empathy. If 1 in 4 people have abortion, 1 in 4 women have abortions, then a lot of the people who are listening to the hate and the rhetoric coming from the anti-abortion movement know that. They know someone. They know someone who's had an abortion. They may not know that they know that.
Exactly.
So the need to make it clear. And I think that everything that we can do to build bridges, to work at the community level, to center abolitionist thinking, not just about criminal justice, but abolishing all systems of oppression so that we can create a multi-issue, multi-generational movement. And I guess lastly, to again keep holding on to that hope. It's not easy today. When every second, every news cycle, you hear things that you say, this should be it. This should be the moment when everybody rises up, and yet they have not yet. But I want to emphasize the yet. I was very inspired last weekend. Loretta organized an amazing intergenerational conference at Smith on reproductive justice futurisms. And there was so many sources of inspiration, not the least of which are the people in our movement whose shoulders we all stand on, and then all these younger people who are carrying it on. So I guess I'm going to leave it there.
Great. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you. Loretta?
I think there is no population in America that feels more battered than Black women voters. Because over and over again, we prove our loyalty to this idea called democracy. We prove our faith by how we turn out, and we prove our hope by the fact that we never give up, not only on the concept of democracy, but in our faith in others to do the right thing. And so it is very trying to constantly rekindle that hope and faith when you've been disappointed so many times. It almost feels like a battered wife syndrome sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But we have no choice. Marlene mentioned my conference that I helped organize last week. And one of the things that we talked about through a reproductive justice futurist lens is that if you recognize that all human life began in Africa, you also have to appreciate that everybody on earth is a cousin, our cousins. And we have to act like that.
Mhm,
That is a fundamental guiding belief
mhm, mhm,
that we have to hold in our hearts. Even like many family members, they disappoint us, they
mhm,
betray us, they don't always stand up for themselves or us in
mhm,
the way that we want, but we're all family. And if you believe that, then you have to act like that. And so I have to honestly say that while I'm disappointed, I'm no longer angry.
mhm,
I gave up anger as my motivation for doing human rights work when I learned to deprogram white supremacists back in the 1990s. And I found out there was a black woman couldn't be mad at the Klan. Who's left? Who's left to be angry at?
Right,
Um,
right.
and so that doesn't mean that I'm not targeted
Mhm,
with my anger because I try to be precise. I have no tolerance or patience for people who intentionally hurt others.
mhm,
I have no tolerance or patience for people who have positions of power and they abuse that power, or
mhm,
hypocrites, or liars. But again, I always believe there's a minority of the population of the earth. I've been to too many countries and in too many situations. I know that in my heart and in my bones. And so I want to work from a place of love, generosity, and grace,
mhm.
understanding that every human being that I meet is a complicated person with their good sides and their bad sides. And I want to use a calling in culture to appeal to the good sides that I know are in them. Because even the most worst jerks are generally kind to their pets or something. I want to appeal to that spark of humanity that's in most human beings and build on that
Mhm.
so that we can clasp each other as family, as cousins, as friends, and at least as co inhabitants of this fragile planet called Mother Earth. I think that that's available for us. I think it's possible. And I actually think it's achievable by those of us if we get rid of our inner Karens and our inner Trumps and not succumb to the hate that they would like us to feel towards them.
Mm. To not succumb to the hate they would like us to feel towards them. Right. So I'm going to thank all three of you so, so much for being in this conversation. And one of the things I'm struck by and when we've talked about what is needed in this time, what I'm hearing, and I just like to make sure that I'm hearing correctly, is I'm hearing a lot about the values we need to make sure we are in touch with and a relationship with others. That's what I'm hearing. So Loretta, you've talked about we need to be engaged from the place of love, generosity, and grace towards everyone. We've talked about the idea that we are all a family, we are cousins, and to come from that perspective, no matter what we do and how we approach people. And I would say that in addition, I'd like to add that part of that, I think, is to be able to stay in that place of love and say no without blaming or shaming the other. Very hard place to be in, but that's a place of being when we are engaged in the resistance to that which we are saying, I'm not going to tolerate. And the other thing I've heard us talk about is sharing the stories, the power of stories to change hearts and minds, right? And to come into community, to find ways to be in community with others. Other things I've heard us talk about today as what we need to build, the kind of resilience we need in order to build the leadership that we need for this time. So, I just want to check. Anyone else want to add anything else before we close? Is that, yep, all right. I just,
The only thing I would add is sometimes you have to dig really deep for those higher angels, Loretta.
absolutely. Oh,
Reach
absolutely.
up, not down. You're going in
Yeah,
the wrong direction.
right. All right. So I want to say thank you so, so much again. And I want to say if you to learn more, you can find where, Loretta, can we find your book, and Marlene, your book, and Ruth, your book? Where can we find your books?
Well, my website is my name, Loretta Ross, or Loretta J. Ross. And so my classes that I teach calling in techniques online are there. And you can order books from Simon and Schuster or through my website.
Great. Marlene?
Well, I'm sorry to say that Undivided Rights is on Amazon. So for those of us who are trying not to do that, buy it from your local bookstore. And Abortion and Reproductive Justice will not be out until the summer, but it will be in time for holiday gifts, etc.
And Ruth, where can we find your book?
Well, my book, which I happen to have here, is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or from the publisher directly. The publisher is McFarland in Jeffersonville, North Carolina, and it's out as an ebook or a regular paperback copy.
Great, great. And you can learn more about how critical women's rights are to women's ongoing opportunities, independence, and freedom through BC Voice's online documentary, Stand Up, Speak Out, The Personal Politics of Women's Rights. Go to www.bcvoices.org and click on the button at the top that says docuseries Stand Up, Speak Out. And so thank you again to Marlene and Loretta and Ruth for being engaged in this conversation. From the 92nd Street Y in New York, I'm Catherine Brewster, and thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.